Welcome back, everybody. It's Luke Humphrey with Hansons Coaching Services again here, and we're moving on to our next lesson. We just talked about physiology in the previous lesson, and so we kind of want to take a step back and really go over kind of our theory of training. And in my mind, the physiology explains a lot of the philosophy. So while the physiology was a very long lesson, this one is much shorter in length, and hopefully we can tie this all in together for you. So we'll get back into some theory of training, a little bit less technical than the physiology that we just wrapped up. So let's jump right back into it and get going. So philosophy or theory for the marathon using the Hanson's philosophy is really it's pretty simple. The whole cornerstone of the training revolves around something called cumulative fatigue. And as you can see here, it's really made up of 4 different components, and those are balance, and that's balance in training, encompassing really the whole aspect of the physiological spectrum that we talked about. Moderate to high mileage, which we'll get into each one of these separately, but if you have a balance in training and you're hitting on all areas of like when we talked about the 2 thresholds, and we talked about VO2 max, and we talked about building that foundation. If you're doing all of those things, then you're going to have balance in your training, but you're also going to be running a fair amount, right? You can't do all of those things in three runs a week, right? So that alone is going to move you into a moderate to higher weekly mileage. And it's not something that we just throw you into. It's obviously something that we have to build you into, but this is really, for your peak marathon training, you're encompassing all these things. So your balance will lead to moderate to high mileage, and if you're maintaining that balance, you'll lead to consistency, right? So you'll be consistent with getting long runs in, and getting tempo runs, and getting strength runs and speed runs and things like that. So and then as we talked about, being consistent over the course of weeks to months to segments, and beyond that to being consistent over the years. Those are the important pillars there. And then lastly, active recovery, which I've toyed around with this, making its own thing or part of the balance, but as you'll notice, all 4 of these things kind of blend together, and without one, the whole system kind of falls apart. So getting off topic a little bit, when people say they're not successful with our program, this is really one of the first things that I look at, and I'll look at these 4 components, and were they all there? And a lot of times they weren't there because I'll just be honest, the most common one is the active recovery. A lot of times people run their easy runs too fast, which then throws off their workouts, their SOS days, like the speed, strength, and long runs. Those get thrown off because the active recovery wasn't there, or if those are too fast, it can even extend beyond that too. So that active recovery not being there or being altered will throw the balance off, because maybe another workout was missed, or maybe 2 workouts were missed, and so then all of a sudden the balance is getting altered, and then the mileage is getting altered, and then the consistency is getting altered. So throwing one of these things off will take away the end result of cumulative fatigue. So it's really important that all 4 of these items be adhered to, and we'll go into each one of these separately. So what exactly is my definition of cumulative fatigue? And my version is that when fatigue is coming from the culmination of training and not from one specific aspect. So, in short, one workout is the one that's throwing you over the edge, or it's not one workout that's getting you fit. It's the culmination of workouts that you've done over weeks and months that's making you feel fatigued. And the key here is being fatigued but still being able to run workouts. Being fatigued and not being able to hit your goal paces on workouts, that's a different story. That's overtraining. But being fatigued but still hitting your paces and still recovering is the key there. Why is it important? Well, when we talk about other races, we talk specifically about race readiness. So if I'm running the 5K, I have to be doing stuff at 5K pace, and I have to be ready to run that 5K distance. And so it's really the same thing here. It's just extrapolated out to the marathon distance. The one thing I want to point out though is that cumulative fatigue is race specific for the marathon. It's not necessarily race specific for the 5K or 10K. How I would handle a person training for those shorter distances is definitely going to be different than how I'm going to have them train for the marathon. The philosophy will be relatively the same, but the order of importance might switch around. But a lot of times what I see, especially when I read coaches who are trying to take one system and make it work the whole way through, where I feel like they get into trouble is they take the same ideas they have for the 5K and 10K and just move it out to the marathon. So I've seen plans where you're doing speed work at the end of a marathon segment where all they talk about for the 5K and 10K is doing race specific work. So yeah, in the 5K and 10K segment, yeah, the speed work would make sense at the end when you're aiming for that goal race. But when you're training for a marathon, that speed doesn't necessarily make sense when you're trying to run a distance that's 7, 8, 10 times longer than what you're training for. So that's the only difference. I mean, they're and not to say their systems don't work, but they'll really try to tell you that this will work for the whole way across the spectrum, but I don't necessarily know if it does or not. And obviously it does. It works for some people, but my observance over the years is that race specific needs to be race specific for that distance, not just take a workout that's worked for your 5K running and just throw it into a marathon segment. So in short, cumulative fatigue is race specific for the marathon. It's there to make you ready for the marathon distance. So when I get emails saying I'm so tired, I don't know how I can't do this over and over and over again. Well, we don't want you to do this over and over and over again. We want you to do this marathon, and then recover, and then do some other stuff, and then maybe come back to the marathon. So, but that's another lesson. But so let's focus on these 4 pillars and the idea that cumulative fatigue is our way of getting you highly race ready for the distance. Okay, so our first pillar here is balance, and they can have a lot of meanings here. So it really means not skipping on a specific type of workout or abandoning one in a segment. So you see there we have easy runs. Easy runs are the cornerstone of our plan. The majority of your weekly mileage will be at an easy pace. It's going to be, I can't remember the exact numbers off of it, but if I remember right, at least 60% of your weekly mileage is technically an easy run. I don't think I have long runs in that number, simply because I do technically consider long runs an SOS type of run, which we'll talk about in another lesson. But basically it's something that's above and beyond what you do for an easy run. And so, your weekly mileage could be, if you throw strictly by pace, including your long runs, you're talking your long runs and easy runs would be at least 70 to 80% of your weekly mileage. So easy runs are crucial, and that goes back to the physiology aspect that we talked about, where we build the foundation first, right? And those are our foundation type runs. That's where we're going to get the most bang for our buck. We're going to really develop those mitochondria. We're going to develop those muscle fibers, and then indirectly through those runs, we'll build our VO2 max, our lactate threshold, our max last steady state thresholds. All those thresholds are indirectly affected by what we can do for easy runs. And that's why when you see people solely focus on speed, particularly for like a 5K or 10K type of program, really what all they're doing is setting the ceiling for their VO2 max. They're really only working the very top of the pyramid. So you can't really pull your fitness up. You really have to push it up from the bottom up. And if you're doing nothing to allow for a bigger foundation, then that pyramid peak is not going to be very high off the ground. So easy runs are crucial. Speed, and that's relative to what you're doing. So the speed work that we do in the marathon is speed relative to the distance, right? So the speed you would do in a 5K, 10K is probably going to be more intense than the speed you're going to do in the marathon. Strength, what we call strength intervals, are really working more of the thresholds that we talked about. The strength would be working more of the max last steady state threshold, that second one that we were talking about. And then your tempo runs, which are done at marathon pace, are really kind of a gray area type of run, but they're a race specific run. So again, for the marathon, tempo runs are marathon pace, but a tempo run when you're training for like a half marathon or a 10K, it still might be marathon pace, but we might be doing it for different reasons, and it could be faster than marathon pace. But by our definition, it's still a tempo run. But it's really it's a fairly significant run for a set amount of mileage with no breaks. So if you're familiar with workouts, speed workouts, you typically envision the track. Strength workouts are longer intervals, like by 6 by 1 mile, 3 by 2 miles, 2 by 3 miles. Those are our bread and butter strength workouts. So you have those components, and they're all working different things. And then long run is really what's building not only your endurance, but also your stamina to some extent. So all of these things are important. So we want to encompass all of these things, but you're thinking, okay, and we have these broken up a little bit, so you won't do a speed and a strength the same week. So you're not doing 1, 2, 3, 4, above and beyond an easy run type of runs a week. You're going to be doing 2 to 3 in a week, and the rest would be easy runs. But what I have in my notes here is that, this isn't really meant to be a bash on a 3-day-a-week program, but you can see right away that if you're only running 3 days a week, it's going to take you a lot longer to fit everything in, because you're going to have to run a longer number of weeks to get the speed in, to get the strength in, to get the tempo runs in, enough to where it's going to raise your fitness to a significant level. So, I'm a big believer of segments that are not overly long. Like even our advanced program is 18 weeks, 16 weeks of it is doing workouts. And, you have a week in the beginning and a week at the end, essentially, give or take, where you're just running easy. And then you're not, you're doing workouts the rest of the week. And that can be a little bit long as well. But the idea that when you're talking about an 18-week plan designed to fit a large spectrum of people, the way it's set up is that it allows people to race, because you remember a lot of times people are using this for a fall marathon, and so they're going to race in the spring shorter distances, and it's really set up to really allow almost 2 segments within one training plan. But as a whole, I don't think if you're doing it this way, then you don't necessarily need a 20, 24, 28, 32-week schedule, because you're getting all these things in on a regular basis. And so when you're running less weekly, you have to extend the number of weeks out that you're running to be able to get fit enough to handle the distance. And so that's a huge difference between what we're accomplishing and what other programs are trying to accomplish. So it's not necessarily me a bash on that, but it just means that you really end up having, at some point you have to fit all that work in, but it's going to be spread out over a much longer period of time if you do it that way. And people will also say, well, I'm cross-training to get my easy runs in. Well, cardiovascular-wise, that's great. It's for a general fitness standpoint, that's awesome. I definitely would encourage it. And if you're a beginning runner, I would rather have you run 3 days a week and cross-train a couple of times a week, and then gradually add in more running and take the cross-training away. So don't think the cross-training has no place. It just depends on the person's situation. But I think you can't interchange easy runs for cross-training, because it's not a direct correlation. That's like somebody saying, okay, I biked 30 miles. How many miles is that equivalent to running? Well, it's not equivalent to any miles running. It's 30 miles biking. That's what you did. You can't just throw a number in there and say you ran X amount of miles, given that you biked a certain amount of miles. It just doesn't work that way. You have the law of specificity, where what you're training for, you have to do what you're training for. And for a general standpoint, cross training is great, but it doesn't directly correlate into the same benefits you would get for an easy run. And essentially because of that weight bearing component to running, as opposed to maybe cycling or elliptical or whatever. But so that's another discussion. But just remember, so we're doing these for a reason, and easy runs you're getting certain things out of. So making it easy, quote unquote, easier, don't take that to heart. By doing that, a biking session instead of an easy run, is there a fitness component to it? Yes, but will it directly relate to the same benefits you'll get from easy run? No, you'll get the cardiovascular benefits, but you may not get the muscular benefits of that, as far as hardening bone, developing muscle fibers to that extent, and even less extent to the muscle fibers. But it's just not the same. And so my goal as a coach would be able to get you as much as I possibly could from cross training into running. And this is more, I guess, for beginning runners and maybe our just finished crowd listening to this. So, okay, and I rambled on a lot about that. But having the balance is part of the big picture, because you can already tell that this is why we want to keep balance. We don't want this to serve as a one-time program. And so what I'm talking about here is, I don't want this to be a one-and-done program. I think the schedule, if you're following a just finished schedule and you do great and you want to take the next step, obviously it's a one and done. But the program itself is something that we can take with us really the rest of our running. We can take the philosophy, alter it to your individuality, and the whole philosophy can work. I've been on it for 11 years now, so I've continually progressed as a runner and developed different things. So it's really more of a long-term approach than, okay, here's a schedule to get you through, here's a schedule to get you to survive this, and then, okay, we'll see you later. So that's not our goal. So our second point there, also keeping each of these in proportion is what you're trying to accomplish, and also allow you to include what is necessary for what your mileage is at. And the Hanson long run is a perfect example. So many, one of the biggest things we get is, why do you only do 16 miles? Well, we'll talk about it more in the components lesson. However, it's not 16. It's not for us. It's not about 16 miles. It's not about 20 miles. It's about running long enough to get what you need, and also allow us to get everything else that we need to get into. We're not putting a single higher emphasis on one component. In most marathon programs, that one component is simply the long run, and it takes away from other things that are going to make you just as good. And so that's our example. So that's us keeping everything in balance. And then lastly, we have the common theme here, which is, all these things are intertwined. So, as I mentioned, balance is intertwined with consistency and active recovery and moderate mileage and all those things. So without one, others will end up failing. Okay, so you may notice we're on consistency, and I missed appropriate mileage, moderate to high volume of weekly mileage, and I didn't necessarily miss it because all these things really both balance and consistency is automatically going to make you have appropriate mileage. So I didn't necessarily miss it. It's really I guess more included in these first two topics. So we talked about balance. If you're getting all the things in that we need to get in, then you're running a significantly big portion of the week, right? So we talked about doing basically 3 workouts a week plus easy runs. So if you only did 1 easy run, you're running 4 days a week at that point. And if you do 2 easy runs, you're doing 5 days a week. And if you're doing 3 easy runs a week, you're doing 6 days a week, right? So just by doing that, then you are going to have moderate to high volume of mileage. You just have to. It's a no-brainer. If you're running a short amount 3 days a week versus a moderate amount 5 or 6 days a week, you're going to have more mileage, right? So that's all we need. That's all we need to really discuss about that, because if you're not doing those things, you're not going to have the mileage. So it's really all kind of snowballed in. And you can really say the same thing about consistency too. If you're being consistent with what you're doing, then not only are you going to have decent mileage one week, but you're going to have it the next week and the next week and the next week. And so it's going to be a long-term effect as well. So getting into consistency, it has to be present in order for the cumulative fatigue to work. And here's where people stop being consistent, because they are starting to feel the effects of cumulative fatigue, and they mistake it for being overtrained, and they take time off, and they end up setting themselves back rather than keep moving forward. If you're tired and take a couple of days off to freshen up, then everything we're doing is really kind of being negated. We want you to be running on tired legs. We want you to feel fatigued when you're trying to run hard. Kevin, when I listened to Kevin do the programs a long time ago, he'd always say it's about the last 16 miles, not the first 16 miles. And that's really what we're trying to put the emphasis on, is how that last 16 miles is going to feel. Because the first 16, everybody, if they're training somewhat appropriately, is going to be able to do without an issue. But that last 16 is where everybody has the problems. And also the consistency forces mental strength to it, and forces that don't give in voice in your head. You really, you're tired and you want to quit, but you don't. You force yourself to do it. And then, so I think there's a mental component to it as well. Develop some of that mental toughness that you're going to need for that second half of the marathon. And then also forces you to focus on the appropriate paces, because when people stop being consistent, it's usually because they haven't run appropriately for what they're trying to accomplish. So you see this a lot, especially with beginning runners, is they'll go out and they'll run their easy days, will end up being faster than their marathon pace. So if that's the case, what that usually tells me is you're probably not running very much during the week, and so you're pretty fresh for every run. And then it also tells me that your weekly volume isn't high enough, because you're not because again you're fresh, and that you can go out and hammer every run when you don't necessarily need to. So that's a huge component of it. Now the thing is, the trick here is that you do have to know what the difference between being sick or overtrained is versus just feeling the fatigue of training. And so the fatigue of training, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is really, okay, you feel tired and you feel like you're not going to hit a workout, but you do hit a workout. So, let's say you're feeling pretty tired, your legs are fatigued, but let's say your marathon pace is, let's say, 8-minute pace per mile, and you think, oh my gosh, there's no way I can do it. And so you go out and you do an 8-mile tempo and you run it at 8-minute pace. That's cumulative fatigue. Let's put you in the same situation, and instead of running 8-minute pace, let's say you run 8:30 pace, and you were hitting 8-minute pace up until, let's say, a couple weeks ago. That's a big sign of being overtrained, because you're not hitting the paces. If you're tired and hitting the paces, that's cumulative fatigue. If you're tired and you're completely bombing workouts, that's the verge of overtraining. And then you have to look at other things like, are you recovering are you getting sleep? Is your nutrition okay? Are you dehydrated? Were you sick? There's a number of things to look at, that's when we need to dig deeper into it. But if you're tired, but you're still hitting workouts, to me, there's not a lot to worry about. You just have to maintain focus on recovering, eating right, trying to get as much sleep as you can, doing ice bath, whatever you need to do to help yourself recover, and keep that train rolling. And if you find yourself where you haven't been doing the best of recovering and you're starting to feel the effects on workouts, and then look at what you're running for your easy days. Are my easy days too fast for what I'm trying to run? Has my other workouts, let's say you hate tempo runs, but you're usually able to do them, but you love intervals and you hammer the heck out of your intervals. And so has that caught up to your ability to run the tempo run? So there's a lot of different things to really look at, and you really kind of have to do some detective work, and then that's why we're here as coaches, and that's why having a coach can definitely help you kind of dive into this detective work and figure out what's actually going on. And more times than not, that's usually the same thing for a fair number of people. I feel like I end up answering the same emails a lot during the marathon training segment. So, but it's because I deal with it a lot. We coach hundreds of runners a year, so we see it a lot. You see it once, and so that's where we can step in and help. But consistency is huge, and consistency in the balance is what's going to lead you to the moderate to high volume of weekly mileage and accumulated mileage over time. But it also means you don't have to have as big a block of training like we talked about either. So you could cut that 24 weeks down to 16 to 18 of total training, and your actual workouts might even be 14 to 16 weeks. So but that's part of an individual component to it. But in general, that moderate to high volume, being consistent and having that balance cuts down the total weekly amount of training time that you actually have to put in. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully the mileage part makes sense as well. So lastly, we have appropriate paces in active recovery. And this goes back to what I was just talking about with being overtrained versus being trained hard, I guess you can say, and having that cumulative fatigue. So in order for everything to happen, we just said this: don't overtrain. And I know what you're thinking is that, especially if you've done the system before and how fatigued you potentially can feel, then you probably think I'm being having an oxymoron here, where it's like, you're not really making sense. You kind of have a double standard here, and it may seem that way, but as we just talked about, the big differences there. That's what's key. So just looking at my notes here. So when people struggle with mileage, what usually happened? Well, it really goes back to the old adage, too much too soon, and too fast. So we have a thing called, and this definitely isn't on any quiz or anything, we have acronym FIT, F-I-T-T, which is frequency, intensity, type of training, and then time training, so duration. So frequency, obviously, we're talking about number of days per week. Intensity, we all know that one. Type, we're focused on running, so that doesn't really change. And then time, it's the time we spent running, in hours, miles, whatever. So 3 of those 4 are changing, right? We really manipulating 3 of those variables. And when you manipulate too many of those variables too soon, usually it's intensity and frequency, we get into trouble. So that's why we have to be careful about just ramping up week after week after week after week. So you really want to be careful with that. And what I will try to, I've always learned that it's frequency first and then intensity. And then time is kind of just going along for the ride. Time will gradually increase on its own as you add the days, and then you add the different type of workouts. The time will just kind of be adjusted automatically. So it's important to keep that in mind. But most of the time, what we'll do when we talk about too much, too fast, too soon, it's exactly what we're talking about. We're bumping the number of days up, we're bumping the intensity up, and then the time automatically will be longer as well. So you really have to be careful of that, and that's when people get hurt. And unfortunately, from a physiology standpoint, your cardiovascular system will actually adapt very, very quickly. So you can tell, like, so let's say you've taken 2 weeks off, and the first 3 days back you feel like you haven't run in years, and then days 4 through 7 you feel like garbage, but you don't feel as bad, and then within the next 7 to 10 days you feel almost normal again. So our cardiovascular fitness can bounce back, like within a couple weeks, whereas bone, tendon, things like that, where we get hurt, right? When we have stress fractures, we get Achilles tendonitis, we get plantar fasciitis, all those things, those take much longer to adapt to work. So it's not necessarily the cardiovascular system we're waiting on, it's the structural components most of the time. We're waiting for bones to get stronger, for tendons to be more stiff and more hardy. That's really what we're usually waiting on. And when we go too much too soon, those tissues are broken down faster than they can repair, and we get hurt. So that's what you have to be careful of. But appropriate paces in active recovery, most people think, oh gosh, okay, so active recovery means time off. No, it means, honestly, what it's meaning is make sure your easy days are easy. Don't run too hard on your easy days. And a lot of this will take care of itself, because you can still recover and run. And don't think of easy mileage as junk mileage, because we learned from our physiology lesson that easy mileage is getting us the most bang for our buck when it comes to mitochondria, muscle fibers, and indirect development of VO2 max, lactate threshold, MLSS, all that good stuff we talked about. So it's not junk mileage, and don't ever let anybody talk to you like it is junk mileage, because it's not. It's very beneficial. Actually, when it's junk mileage is when you're running your easy days too fast, and then it doesn't allow you to get the rest of your workouts in for the week. That's when it's junk mileage. So let me look at my notes here. And the big thing is too, so if you are running your easy runs too fast, what happens is a lot of times you start to get overtrained, you start to feel fatigued, and then you take those days off. And so now you're affecting your balance because you miss workouts, and you're affecting your consistency if you're taking time off. So you have to be careful there. And so it really comes down to something as simple as making sure your easy days are easy. And in the beginning, it's probably the toughest, because especially if you're doing like the beginner program or the just finished program, because you can handle the mileage isn't overwhelming, and the intensity isn't too great. So it's very easy to feel fresh in those early 2 to 6 weeks, let's say. and then the damage is already done and it catches up to you at 10, 12 weeks into the cycle. So you might not feel it right away, and that's another key component. So what you do now might not affect you right this second, but it's definitely going to take a toll on you over time if you're doing it on a regular basis. So that's another thing to think about. Just trying to think what else was I going to say about that, but I think that's the key, is where we have to be very, very diligent on our easy runs. And I think part of it's just because we're always told easy mileage is just junk mileage, and it's really not. Easy mileage really should be viewed as our foundational mileage and what's going to establish how high our ceiling can ultimately be. And by doing our easy runs at our appropriate paces, we let our bones adapt at the appropriate rate, and we let everything kind of go in sync, and we'll actually become much fitter, much more fit, much sooner if we can run easier on our easy days. Now, I'm not saying, back off on everything else too. I'm just saying that run what's appropriate for what you're trying to accomplish. So if you want to run a 4-hour marathon, all your training should be based around a 4-hour marathon. Same thing for a 3-hour marathon, same thing for a 2:30 marathon. It doesn't matter. It's all got to be appropriate to what you're trying to train for. And that's what makes this very interchangeable. The faster you get, the system is still the same. It's just adjusting to your individual goal. But appropriate paces, active recovery, ultimately goes back to easy runs. Make sure your easy runs are at an easy enough pace to allow you to recover and not miss time, and build your easy aerobic foundation, which is going to allow everything else to go much, much better for you. So I know that's long-winded. Okay, so after all that made you suffer through physiology lesson and a philosophy lesson, we can finally get into what you really want, is the training schedules and the components of the schedule. So, all this we talked about for the Just Finish crowd. I think it's important for you just to kind of start learning that foundation of what we're talking about. Although some of this won't be in your schedules, because we're going to focus on, going back to that fit that I talked about, the FITT. We have to take a step even further back with you folks and really start out with just building your frequency in your time, rather than worry too much about the intensity. And again, because it's, we want to allow the right adaptations to occur and build that foundation. But for the rest of you, now we're talking about, okay, what's this mean for actual training? What's this going to mean for, you talked about SOS days. What does that mean? Okay, so we'll get into those things. We'll get into the components of the schedule. What's an SOS day? We'll give you the training schedule so you can actually train. Now, granted, you're probably looking at this and you probably already have the schedule, because I'm going to put the PDFs up on there as well so you can have them right away, just for a time factor, because you might need to be starting to training and learning at the same time. So, but we'll get these out to you, and I'll go over them a little bit, and then into the running components of the schedule. So that'll be the meat of the potatoes of all the programs, and then we'll get into other things like supplemental activities and nutrition and all that good stuff. But this is the heart of the program and what you need to have first before we do any of the extra fun stuff. So that we're good with this lesson, and hope all of you can take something from this with you, and I will talk to you later. Thanks for listening, watching, and I will talk to you later. All right, bye.